Afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about A Good Small Thing by Raymond Carver. So, to summarize this short story, it's focused on a family of three: a young woman named Anne, her husband Howard, and their son Scotty. And to begin the story, they are celebrating their son's birthday, and Anne calls a baker to make him her cake to celebrate. And the baker is described as being a short, abrupt man, not necessarily rude, but also not friendly. And the very next day, Scotty is walking along the street and is hit by a car in a hit and run, and he injures his head. And later that night, as Anne is talking to him, he falls into a deep sleep. And they rush him to the hospital, and they are very terrified of their son's condition. And the doctor claims that he's not in a coma. And although the doctor claims this, he very much seems to be, as he's not waking up and he's been like this for days. He keeps saying that the son will be fine, but they're not sure why he's not waking up. All throughout this, the baker is calling about the cake for pickup, but is not identifying himself. So Anne hasn't picked up the cake, and he's pestering both Anne and Howard about it. And they begin to think that he's a prank caller who's trying to terrorize them about the condition of their son. Eventually, as the story goes on, Scotty does not wake up until one certain moment where he opens his eyes and he looks at Anne and Howard. They have a short series of communication, which Scotty does not speak back, and then he dies. And they are absolutely devastated by this. And the baker continues to call, and as he calls again, Anne is very angry and then realizes that it's the baker, and she decides to go and confront him. And she tells him that her son has died. He feels very sympathetic and he's very apologetic, and he invites them into the shop and has a conversation with him about his own struggles in life, how he's lonely, and he feeds them food, and he gives them a quote, good small thing, and shows them kindness and connect through this tragedy and trauma. So the analysis I kind of just hinted on. To me, what I extracted as the main theme was that through tragedy and this event and the disconnected lives before came connection and hope from all this. Um, Before all this occurred, Anne and Howard were not very connected. Howard at one point remarks on how so far he had kept away from real harm, from those forces he knew existed and could cripple or bring down a man. And up until this point, he hadn't faced any hardships. He talks about how no one around him has died, how he basically has this perfect life, and that now all this has fallen apart. But at one point, Anne and Howard have an exchange in which Anne talks about how she's been praying and asks if Howard would do the same. And when he remarks that he has, she says, for the first time, she felt they were in it together, this trouble. She hadn't let Howard into it, though he was there. And so, through this event in which Scotty is in a coma and eventually will die, they learn to bond with each other and come together in this situation. Another example of this is the baker, who began as this abrupt, short, unfriendly man, arguably the most isolated character of any of them. And in the end, he, when learning about this traumatic event and the tragedy that Anne and Howard have gone through, he opens up about his own life and the loneliness he feels and his childless life and the baking that keeps him busy, and he feeds them these small rolls, which is significant as Anne keeps remarking on how she hasn't eaten throughout this whole experience. And this good small thing is the idea of hope, that even through tragedy you can connect with strangers and you can learn to express sympathy, and though it's horrible what happened to Anne and Howard, they learn that sympathy is a very powerful thing. So the other story we read from Raymond Carver was Popular Mechanics, which was the Mad Lib-like story. And in this, there's some similarities and there's some differences. So one of the similarities that I noticed between the two was that the central focus of the story is a mother, father, and a child. And especially the relationship seems to be that it's not really about the child and that the child is going through traumatic things, but it's more about the mother and the father in relation to the child and the experience that they have with their concern of the child. So in Popular Mechanics, the child is being argued over and who's going to take the child. And in A Good Small Thing, Howard and Anne are extremely worried about their child and whether he may die or whether he's healthy. One big difference is whereas in Popular Mechanics, the characters are selfish and unnamed, Anne and Howard are named and are described in great detail. There's other people in the story, and whereas it seems like the unnamed characters in Popular Mechanics don't care for their son, Anne and Howard clearly do. And whereas the other mother and father seem to have a broken home, Anne and Howard seem to have had an almost perfect life up until this point. And another difference is that there's a sense of division and togetherness in both stories and differently in both stories. Whereas in Popular Mechanics, the woman and man are very obviously divided over the child and stay that way, if not become more divided over the child in the conclusion of the story. Anne and Howard begin as divided over the child and become united over their concern for the child throughout the story and grow more connected with the people around them and with each other through the concern over their child. So in relation to one of the stories we read in class, I found a great connection between this and Killings by Andre Dudas. I think one of the big similarities is that devastating fear of your child dying or being killed. So one of the quotes from A Good Small Thing from Anne, she says about the baker who keeps calling and seems to be taunting them. She said, "That bastard, I'd like to kill him," she said. "I'd like to shoot him and watch him kick." And we see a very similar sentiment over the death of the son in Killings, who obviously motivates similar feelings of murderous blame. And that devastating fear we see in Anne, she says to a young girl that had their son die as well. She says, "Don't have children," she told the young girl's image as she entered the front door of the hospital. "For God's sake, don't." And through that, we see the paralyzing fear of your child and the possibility that they might die. We saw that as well in Killings with the father. He, quote, "He was always a fearful father. When his children were young, at the start of each summer, he thought of them drowning in the pond or the sea." So we see a similar sentiment of that fear of your child dying and or being killed, which happened in both stories. Another component is that the murderer seems to walk free, and this is much more significant in Killings, as this is what led to the death. And in A Good Small Thing, the person that was responsible for hitting Scotty with the car checks to see if Scotty's alive and drives away. He takes no responsibility, he takes no blame for the eventual death of Scotty. Thank you. Please leave any questions below, and thank you for listening.